The Vandals were becoming more and more established in Africa, and any attempts of the Romans to dislodge them from there ended in failure for the empire. Internal strife continued to shake the imperial power. Rival commanders wanted more and more benefit for themselves. Unreliable federates barbarians, and to the borders approached new formidable enemies. Once disparate tribes of Huns united under the rule of the great conqueror Attila, who would later be called the Scourge of God. The Vandals of Gaiseric defeated the army of the Roman commander Aspar, who had arrived in Africa. This battle is only reported by Procopius, so modern historians have suggested that it was only a minor skirmish. Be that as it may, Africa still remained for the Vandals, and the Romans fled whoever was going where. The Vandals' conquest of Africa is usually painted in the darkest colors, and Gaiseric's men are attributed completely ridiculous atrocities, up to the fact that they allegedly uprooted fruit trees and killed captives, leaving their bodies to decompose in order to cause an epidemic and thus kill the remaining locals. These stories appear to be outright lies. The Vandals, like all Germans, were extremely practical and sensible people. Of course, they did not plan to turn the African province into a scorched desert, intending to live here happily ever after. The stereotype of Vandals as people prone to senseless destructive activities appeared much later in connection with quite different events, and the horrors that 60 years after the conquest of Africa by the Vandals told about them later historians, caused by shock and frustration. As we remember, Boniface, who was the ruler of Africa, actually surrendered this province to the barbarians and returned, defeated, to Italy, to the Emperor Valentinian III, and even more precisely, to his mother Gail Placidia, who managed all affairs on behalf of her weak-willed son. Placidia as if did not hold on Bonifacius' evil, but flared up with renewed vigor a reconcilable enmity between Bonifacius and his main rival Aetius, who a few years earlier allegedly plotted against him a vicious intrigue and slandered before the emperor. Much remains unclear in this story. Boniface also had his own army, and it too consisted of barbarians loyal to him. Between Bonifacius and Aetius a real war broke out, which ended with the Battle of Rimini, and Bonifacius in this battle won. However, Boniface could not use the fruits of his victory. He was mortally wounded and died, according to the most common version, 3 months after the incident. As for the marriage of Aetius and Pelagia, it did take place. Pelagia at that time was expecting to receive a rich inheritance from Spain, another indirect confirmation that she belonged to the Vandal people. Anyway, Aetius went to his estate and lived there for some time, until he was assassinated by unknown enemies. It must be assumed that the lucky and cunning patrician had many of them. Aetius fled to Rome, thence to Dalmatia and finally to Pannonia, to his kind Huns, with whom he had established friendly relations from a young age. The strife within the empire was to the advantage of Gaiseric, who now almost no one prevented him from completing his settlement in Africa. As already mentioned, he was in no hurry, acting consistently and as if calmly. In February 435 in the city of Hippon, Gaiseric signed a peace treaty with the empire. As a proof of good intentions, Gaiseric gave his son Honoric as a hostage to the emperor of the Western Roman Empire and undertook to pay tribute from those African territories that actually already belonged to the Vandals. However, even after the signing of the peace treaty, the Vandals did not settle down. Aetius bogged down in Gaul and could not come to the aid of the Romans in Africa, and Gaiseric, acting consistently and methodically, eventually reached Carthage. The city was captured by the Vandals and ravaged. The local Roman nobles fled in panic, leaving all property in the hands of the Vandals. Having seized Carthage, the main port of Africa, Gaiseric decided to seize at the same time in Sicily, but here he has already given a strong rebuff. Against Gaiseric was the master of the army Sigismund. If the Vandals managed to extend their dominance to this island, the entire trade in the Mediterranean Sea would be threatened. This could not be allowed, and the Emperor of the Eastern Empire sent a huge fleet to the aid of his Western counterpart. Gaiseric retreated from Sicily and sent an embassy to Constantinople, once again to negotiate peace, and in 442 the world was concluded. To take away from Vandals Africa nobody and did not think, obviously, empire it was not under force, but to defend Sicily Romans could. The Romans were forced to recognize the new barbarian state in Africa, and the most fertile lands of the empire passed into foreign hands. Gaiseric, like all his people, professed Christianity in the Arian form. With the name of this king is associated persecution of Catholics throughout his subject Africa. Gaiseric carefully guarded his power from any possible attempts and did not limit himself to persecution of Catholics. He also had political opponents in the Vandal camp. From time to time someone brought up the king's ignorant origin, who was only a collateral son. Claims to the throne began to be made by the sons of Gunderic, the late brother of Gaiseric, the legitimate son. Gaiseric ordered, it is said, the mother of his nephews to be drowned in the river. Apparently, it was she who sought power for her sons. However, to take advantage of the strife at the Vandal court of the Roman Empire could not. It was looming on her much more terrible threat. Until now, the Huns did not appear to the Romans, let us say, regular enemy. From time to time, scattered tribes made raids, but they were repulsed. Sometimes Hunnic detachments were hired to serve the empire and, having accomplished the task, returned to their nomads. But at some point the situation changed. The Huns had a leader who united his people into a powerful force. The Huns roamed within Dacia and the Transdanubian part of the province of Lower Messia. Decades later they had already gained lands in the northern part of Pannonia. Here, to the Hagan, named Roila, fled after the defeat in the last battle with Bonifacius Aetius. The Huns had a treaty with the empire, but naturally were constantly trying to improve conditions for themselves. In particular, Roila was dissatisfied with the fact that some Hunnish detachments went to the service of the empire, so he sent an embassy to Constantinople and demanded to give him all tribesmen who went to the empire. While sluggishly flowed negotiations, Roila died, and in Constantinople on this occasion was served a thanksgiving service. However, the Romans celebrated early. They simply did not guess who would replace the former leader. It were nephews of late Hagan, sons of his brother Mundzuk by name Bleda and Attila. Later, Bleda would be killed by his brother. The name, Attila, is probably known to every person of European culture. An embassy from the empire was sent to the new rulers of the Huns, Attila and Bleda. The Roman delegation was headed by the master of the army in Thrace, Goth Plintha. The ambassadors arrived in the city of Marg on the Danube. On the left bank of the river was the fortress of Constantius, and there Attila's representatives came. The negotiations were conducted on horseback, outside the city, according to Hunnic custom. The Romans pledged to expel all Huns who had come over to them in their time and not to accept them into their service again. In addition, they promised to hand over Roman prisoners who had escaped from the Huns without paying a ransom, or, alternatively, to pay a ransom of 8 solidi per person. An important point was the agreement to open markets for the Huns in border towns. After receiving Hun defectors, Attila had several of them crucified on a cross, and then, the Huns seemed to leave the empire alone. But like any peace with barbarians, the treaty with the Huns proved fragile. During a fair in one of the border towns, the Huns attacked the Romans. From Constantinople to them flew a request. For what reason was made iniquity? The Huns replied that Bishop Marga stole some Hunnish treasures, digging them out of the royal burials, and threatened war if the guilty party was not extradited. Negotiations began again, which led to nothing. The Huns captured and sacked the fortress of Viminatium. In the end, Bishop Marga himself went to the Huns. He admitted his guilt and promised to surrender the city to the Huns in atonement. Those believed in his repentance and good intentions, and the bishop returned to his city with a large Hunnish detachment. This troop hid in hiding during the day, and at night the bishop let the enemy into the gates. After this impressive victory, Attila demanded money from the emperor. Having received an unsatisfactory answer, Attila has ruined the lands of Dacia and has grasped Ratsiaria, the main city of coastal Dacia. Romans could give him little to counter. Military forces of empire were at that time distracted by Africa and Gaiseric. Here again we encounter some ambiguous, barbarian intrigue. It is quite obvious that the bishop's theft of some Hunnish treasures from the tombs, if any, was only a pretext for the outbreak of hostilities. Gothic historian Jordan, for example, believes that Attila pushed to conflict with the Romans none other than cunning Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, and his main goal was not even the Romans, but their allies, the Visigoths, and here is the reason. Heiseric's son, Guneric, married the daughter of the Visigothic king Theodorid. For some time this marriage suited everyone, but then Guneric, characterized by cruelty even with his children, sent the unfortunate woman back to her father with a cut-off nose and cut-off ears, suspecting in preparing poison for her husband. After such an act, Gaiseric not without reason feared revenge from the tribesmen of his wife, so to distract Theodoric from his family, he allegedly bribed Attila and set him on the Visigoths. Proof of this, however, cannot be found. In any case, Theodoric decided to remain loyal to the empire and declared the Huns his enemies. Meanwhile, and this seems paradoxical, the patrician Aetius, in contrast to the barbarian king, still remained on friendly terms with the Huns. The empire was still paying them not to touch its possessions. It was as if the Roman world had frozen on the eve of a great new battle with the barbarian world, which would go down in history as the Battle of Catalaunian Fields.